The night in Ouagadougou was deeper than usual, suffocating in its stillness. An eerie silence hung in the air like a funeral shroud, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for some unknown danger to strike. It was 2:30 a.m., and the presidential palace, which usually gleamed with lights and bustled with the constant movement of guards and staff, was shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The towering walls, where Burkina Faso's proud flag of red, white, and green normally danced in the evening breeze, were now hidden in shadows that seemed to swallow even the moonlight. The streets of Ouagadougou told their own story in the darkness. Narrow alleys that during the day echoed with the calls of merchants selling mangoes and millet, the laughter of children playing football with makeshift balls, and the constant hum of motorcycles weaving through traffic, now lay empty and forgotten. Even the stray dogs that usually roamed these streets had disappeared, as if they too sensed the approaching danger. Inside the palace, President Ibrahim Traore was sleeping deeply in his chamber, his breathing steady and peaceful. The 36-year-old leader had spent the evening reviewing agricultural reports and plans for new schools in the northern provinces. His desk still held papers detailing his vision for Burkina Faso's future, a nation free from the grip of foreign mining companies, where children could attend school without fear, where farmers could own their land without interference from distant corporations. He had no idea that death was knocking at his doorstep, that the very soldiers he had trusted with his life were now moving through his palace with murder in their hearts. But a pair of crimson eyes, glowing like embers in the darkness of night, were watching everything. Diablo, the president's loyal war dog, stood alert on his powerful paws in the corridor outside Traore's chamber. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep within his chest, his body covered in custom-made armor that bore the scars of previous battles. He wasn't just an ordinary dog, he was a living weapon, a shadow that moved between worlds, a creature that had been forged in war and knew neither fear nor mercy when it came to protecting his master. The armor that covered Diablo's body was a masterpiece of Burkinabe engineering, created by local craftsmen who had learned their trade from their fathers and grandfathers. Made from lightweight titanium alloy and Kevlar, it was painted in the colors of the Sahel, sandy browns and deep blacks that helped him blend into shadows. Across his chest was emblazoned the coat of arms of Burkina Faso, and around his neck hung a small amulet that Traore's grandmother had blessed, believing it would protect both dog and master from evil spirits. Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, was a city of contrasts and stories. During the day, its streets were rivers of life. Merchants from the Sahel selling intricate silver jewelry, women balancing enormous baskets of tomatoes and onions on their heads, children in bright uniforms walking to school while greeting everyone with respectful bows. The red dust-covered roads, sun-gleaming markets where the scent of grilled meat mixed with the sweet aroma of hibiscus tea, and vast green fields stretching to the horizon told the story of a nation that had been fighting for its identity and winning small victories for centuries. The Grand Mosque stood majestically in the city center, its mud brick architecture a testament to the architectural genius of the Sahelian people. Around it, the central market buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk. Traders from Mali and Niger bringing salt and dates, local farmers selling millet and sorghum, and craftsmen displaying hand-woven textiles in patterns that had been passed down through generations. But at this hour in the night, when the moon hid behind heavy clouds and the air was thick with the promise of rain, the city was engulfed in a terrifying silence. Outside the palace, in the narrow alleys lined with mud brick houses, only a few dogs were barking in the distance, and dust particles danced in the sparse streetlight as if a storm was approaching from the depths of the Sahara. President Ibrahim Traore wasn't an ordinary leader, and his story was woven into the very fabric of Burkina Faso's struggle for independence. At 36 years old, He was not only the youngest president in the nation's history, but also one of the most beloved. Born in a small village in the north where his father was a teacher and his mother a nurse, Traore had grown up understanding both the power of education and the importance of caring for others. As a young man, he had joined the military not for glory or power, but because he believed that sometimes a nation must be willing to fight for its right to exist. He was known among his soldiers for his quiet voice that could command attention in any room, his habit of deep thinking before making decisions, and his refusal to send others into battles he wouldn't fight himself. During his years as a commander, he had led operations against terrorist groups that threatened villages, always ensuring that civilian casualties were minimized and that humanitarian aid reached those who needed it most. When he entered politics, it was with a revolutionary vision. He had promised to lead his people towards a new era, a nation where poverty would not be accepted as inevitable, where corruption would be rooted out like weeds from a garden, and where foreign interference would become nothing more than a bitter memory of the past. His speeches, delivered in both French and Moor, touched people's hearts because they spoke of specific changes. New wells for villages without water, schools built with local materials by local workers, and most importantly, a renegotiation of mining contracts that had been bleeding the nation's wealth for decades. These policies had made him beloved among his people, but they had also worried the great powers whose corporations had grown rich from Burkina Faso's gold, uranium, and other resources. In the gleaming towers of Paris, London, and New York, men in expensive suits had begun to speak of Traore as a problem that needed to be solved. But that night, lying in his simple bed, he had refused the ornate furniture of previous presidents. He was just a man, his pistol placed on the side table within easy reach, completely unaware that his most trusted soldiers had been bought, their loyalty purchased with promises of money and power. Diablo's story was intertwined with the president's like the threads of a traditional Burkina Faso textile, creating a pattern that told of loyalty, survival, and the unbreakable bond between man and beast. 3 years ago, when Traore was still a military commander leading operations in the eastern provinces, he had discovered the aftermath of a terrorist attack on a small farming village called Bomba. The village had been burned, its granaries emptied, and its people scattered. In the ruins of what had once been the village school, Traore found an injured puppy, barely alive, lying beside the body of a teacher who had apparently died trying to protect the children. The puppy was from a unique breed, a mix of Burkina Faso's indigenous dogs, known for their intelligence and loyalty, and German shepherds that had been brought to the region decades earlier for military training. What made this puppy extraordinary were his eyes, crimson red, as if coals were still burning within them. Local villagers who saw him whispered that he was blessed by the spirits of warriors, that he had been sent to fight alongside those who protected the innocent. Traore, though not particularly superstitious, felt an immediate connection to the wounded animal. He took the puppy back to the base, nursed him to health with his own hands, feeding him with milk, and later with meat from his own rations. As the dog grew, soldiers began calling him Diablo, because of his fierce red eyes and his uncanny ability to sense danger before anyone else. When Traore became president, Diablo was formally inducted into the Presidential Guard and given specialized training. This training was unlike anything given to ordinary guard dogs. Diablo learned not just to attack and defend, but to think tactically. He was taught to distinguish between different types of threats, to move silently through various terrains, and to work in coordination with human soldiers. His training included urban warfare, desert survival, and even basic first aid. He could fetch medical supplies and apply pressure to wounds with his teeth when directed. The special bulletproof armor that protected him was not just functional but symbolic. Created by local metalworkers using techniques passed down from the era when Burkina Faso's warriors fought with spears and shields, it was lightweight but incredibly durable. The armor made him look like a mythical creature, a guardian spirit that had stepped out of ancient legends to protect the nation in its hour of need. His training went beyond physical skills. Diablo had been conditioned to read human emotions and intentions through scent, body language, and even the subtle changes in heartbeat that he could detect when close to a person. He could sense fear, aggression, and deception with an accuracy that amazed even experienced soldiers. In battle, he could make split-second decisions about who to attack and who to spare, understanding the difference between enemy combatants and innocent civilians. Inside the palace, 10 elite soldiers, men who had been carefully selected to protect the president based on their records of loyalty and courage, were now moving through corridors like ghosts, hidden in the uniforms they had worn with pride for years. These were not ordinary traitors. They were men who had fought alongside Traore, who had shared meals with him, who had listened to his dreams for Burkina Faso's future with apparent enthusiasm. The transformation of these soldiers from protectors to assassins had not happened overnight. For months, they had been approached by agents representing interests they were told were bigger than any one country. They had been offered money, more money than they could earn in 10 lifetimes of military service. They had been told that Traore's policies were naive, that his resistance to foreign investment would lead Burkina Faso into poverty and isolation. But more than money, they had been threatened. Photos of their families had been shown to them, their wives at the market, their children walking to school, their elderly parents sitting in front of their homes. The message was clear: cooperate or lose everything you love. There was no fear on their faces as they moved through the palace, only cold determination born from a mixture of greed and terror. They carried the latest military rifles, equipped with silencers and night vision scopes. They had wireless headsets in their ears, connecting them to handlers who sat in air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away, watching the operation unfold through satellite feeds. In their pockets was a detailed plan. Kill the president quietly, stage the scene to look like a terrorist attack, and prepare for the installation of a more cooperative leader who would reverse Traore's nationalistic policies. The plan had been refined over months, taking into account every possible variable, except for one thing that their foreign handlers had dismissed as irrelevant: Diablo. They thought it would be easy. They had spent weeks learning the palace's security protocols. They had disabled the alarm systems with codes provided by their handlers. They had redirected the security cameras to loop old footage, and they had used their authority to dismiss the night patrols. Everything had been calculated, every contingency planned for. But they hadn't accounted for the warrior spirit that flowed through the veins of both the president and his four-legged guardian, and for the deep connection between a man and his dog that transcended all the sophisticated planning of their foreign masters. Diablo was positioned strategically beneath the palace's high, vaulted ceilings, his body moving like liquid shadow across the marble floors that had been polished by generations of palace workers. The palace itself was a blend of traditional African architecture and colonial influences. High ceilings designed to keep the interior cool, intricate wooden carvings that told the story of Burkina Faso's kingdoms, and wide corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of chiefs and kings. His sensitive nose was working overtime, analyzing every scent that drifted through the air. He could smell the familiar odors of the palace, the polish used on the wood, the cleaning solutions, and the lingering aroma of the evening meal that had been prepared in the kitchens. But layered over these familiar scents were new ones that made his hackles rise. The sharp metallic smell of gun oil on weapons that had been recently cleaned and loaded, the acrid odor of nervous sweat that traders couldn't hide despite their training, and something else, a chemical smell that seemed foreign, out of place in this African palace. His ears, trained to pick up sounds that human ears would miss, caught fragments of whispered conversations conducted in the shadows. The soldiers were communicating in code, but their words carried meaning that Diablo's training had taught him to recognize. Target is on the 3rd floor. Break down the door, 1 bullet to the head, then extraction. Make it look like terrorism. These men had forgotten that Diablo had been present during their training sessions, that he had learned to associate certain phrases and tones with hostile intent. They had made the mistake of underestimating him, thinking of him as just an animal rather than as a soldier who happened to walk on 4 legs. Diablo waited with the patience of a predator. His body was coiled like a steel spring, every muscle prepared for explosive action. His crimson eyes reflected the thin rays of light that filtered through the palace windows, giving him an otherworldly appearance. The armor that covered his body seemed to absorb light, making him nearly invisible in the shadows. When the soldiers finally approached the president's room, moving in a tactical formation they had practiced countless times, Diablo made his move. The first soldier, a sergeant named Ouedraogo, who had once praised Diablo's intelligence and given him treats from his own rations, never saw death coming. Diablo struck with the silent efficiency of a natural predator enhanced by military training. His powerful jaws, strengthened by years of specialized exercises, caught the man's throat in a grip that was both precise and lethal. The soldier's rifle, a modern assault weapon equipped with the latest targeting systems, clattered to the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the corridor like a death knell. His eyes, wide with shock and the realization that his betrayal had been discovered, stared up at the ceiling as his life ebbed away. His hands clawed briefly at Diablo's armored head, but the dog's grip was unbreakable, his determination absolute. The other soldiers, highly trained men who had faced enemy fire in the deserts and forests of the Sahel, found themselves facing something they hadn't prepared for, a 4-legged soldier who knew their tactics and had the advantage of speed, stealth, and righteous fury. "What was that?" one hissed, his voice carrying the edge of fear that he tried to suppress. These were men who had been told they were part of an elite operation, that they were serving a higher purpose by removing an obstacle to progress and stability. "It's that cursed dog," one whispered, his hands shaking as he raised his rifle. "We should have killed it first." Their flashlights created chaotic beams in the darkness, but Diablo had already vanished, melting back into the shadows like a ghost returning to its realm. He had studied these corridors for 3 years, knew every alcove and hidden passage, every architectural detail that could provide cover or a strategic advantage. The soldiers tried to reorganize, their training kicking in as they formed a defensive circle and began moving methodically toward the president's chamber. But Diablo struck again, this time from above, dropping from a decorative balcony like a furry thunderbolt. His attack was surgical in its precision. Claws that had been strengthened and sharpened tore through Kevlar vests as if they were paper. His teeth, white and gleaming in the darkness, found gaps in body armor with an accuracy that spoke of both intelligence and training. He moved like a force of nature, dodging bullets that shattered marble statues and ancient wooden screens, leaping off walls with an agility that defied gravity, bringing down soldiers who outweighed him by more than 100 pounds. Each attack was followed by immediate withdrawal. Diablo would strike, inflict maximum damage, and then disappear before the remaining soldiers could coordinate a response. It was guerrilla warfare at its most effective, conducted by a warrior who understood that victory often belonged not to the strongest, but to the smartest and most determined. President Traore awoke to the sound of gunfire echoing through his palace like thunder in the storm. His heart immediately began racing, but his mind remained clear, a trait that had served him well during his military career. Without hesitation, he rolled out of bed and grabbed his pistol from the side table, checking the magazine in one smooth motion that spoke of years of training and experience. As he moved toward his chamber door, he caught sight of a scene that would have terrified most civilians, but filled him with fierce pride. Diablo stood in the corridor, his armor gleaming with moisture that might have been water or blood, positioned over the motionless bodies of two soldiers who had sworn to protect their president with their lives, but had chosen money over honor. Their rifles lay broken and scattered, their bodies testimony to the fury of a loyal guardian who had discovered treachery in his own den. The sight was both terrible and beautiful, justice served by a creature who understood loyalty in its purest form. Traore whispered softly, his voice carrying both affection and respect. "Well done, son, well done." But even as he spoke these words, he knew this was just the beginning. The palace shook with a tremendous explosion that seemed to tear through the very foundations of the building. Windows shattered, ancient artwork fell from walls, and somewhere in the distance alarms finally began to wail, too late to prevent the betrayal, but perhaps not too late to rally the faithful. Another team was coming, larger, better equipped, more dangerous than the first. These would not be local soldiers corrupted by foreign gold, no connection to Burkina Faso, no hesitation about murdering an African president who had dared to put his people's interests above corporate profits. Diablo turned toward his master, blood from minor wounds mixing with dust and debris on his armor. His crimson eyes met Traore's, and in that moment, a communication passed between them that needed no words. They had faced danger together before, in the forests and villages where terrorists had threatened innocent people. They would face this danger together too. "We'll stop them together," Traore said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had never retreated from a fight, who had never abandoned his principles in the face of threats. Diablo took a step forward, his body language radiating readiness and determination. His crimson eyes seemed to glow brighter in the darkness, as if lit by an inner fire that no amount of foreign money or sophisticated weaponry could extinguish. He wasn't just a dog defending his master. He was the embodiment of Burkina Faso itself, proud, fierce, uncompromising in the face of those who would steal its freedom and dignity. He was the guardian not just of one man, but of the hopes and dreams of an entire nation that had dared to believe it could control its own destiny. Smoke filled the palace corridors like a poisonous fog rising from the depths of hell, carrying with it the acrid smell of explosives and the metallic tang of spilled blood. The ancient stones of the palace, which had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, seemed to weep as chunks of masonry fell from the ceiling like tears. President Ibrahim Traore crouched behind a massive marble column that had been carved by artisans generations ago, its surface now scarred by bullet holes. He gripped his pistol firmly, his knuckles white with tension, but his breathing remained controlled and steady. His heart was beating rapidly, but his eyes remained calm and focused, the eyes of a soldier who had faced death before and understood that panic was the enemy of survival. Diablo stood beside him, his powerful frame pressed against the president's leg in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. His armor was now bloodied and dusty, bearing the marks of battle like a warrior's medals. Several small dents showed where bullets had struck but failed to penetrate, testament to the skill of the craftsman who had forged his protection. But his crimson eyes still glowed with undiminished intensity in the darkness, like coals that refused to be extinguished by wind or water. The first attack had failed catastrophically for the attackers. 10 elite soldiers, men who had shared bread with the president and had sworn sacred oaths to defend him, now lay as corpses scattered throughout the palace corridors. Their betrayal had been complete, but so had been their defeat. Their blood soaked into carpets that had been woven by local artisans. Their weapons lay broken and useless, their dreams of foreign gold buried with them in the rubble of their dishonor. But now a new threat loomed on the horizon, more lethal, more organized, and infinitely more dangerous than the first wave of attackers. The explosion's echo still reverberated through the corridors like the rumble of distant thunder when President Traore heard a familiar voice crackling through his wireless earpiece. It was Colonel Sande, speaking from the palace security control room, his voice tight with tension and barely controlled fear. "Mr. President, we have movement on all perimeters. The second wave is here. Professional soldiers, at least 15 men, heavily armed and equipped with military-grade equipment. They're not Burkinabe. These are foreign mercenaries." Traore's jaw tightened as he processed this information. He had expected this moment would come eventually, the moment when those who opposed his policies would abandon all pretense of working within legal or diplomatic channels and resort to naked violence. But knowing it would happen and experiencing it were two very different things. He checked his pistol's magazine with practiced efficiency. 5 bullets remained, enough to make each shot count, not enough for a prolonged firefight against professional killers. He looked down at Diablo, whose ears were moving constantly, swiveling like radar dishes as he processed the sounds of approaching danger. "Stay ready, son," he whispered, his voice carrying both affection and the steely resolve of a commander preparing for battle. Diablo responded with a low growl that seemed to emerge from the very depths of his being. His body was coiled like a steel spring, every muscle tense and ready for explosive action. The bond between man and dog had been forged in the fires of previous battles, strengthened by shared hardships and mutual respect. The second team was indeed something entirely different from the corrupted palace guards who had launched the first attack. These were members of what intelligence services across Africa had come to know as shadow units, elite mercenary groups composed of former special forces soldiers from various countries, men who had been discharged from regular armies for various reasons, but who had retained their deadly skills.
These were not soldiers fighting for ideology or patriotism, but professionals who sold death to the highest bidder. They had operated in conflicts across Africa and the Middle East, always in the shadows, always with plausible deniability for their employers. Their services were expensive but thorough. They were the cleaning crews that corporate boardrooms and government offices called when more subtle methods had failed. Their black masks were designed to absorb light, making them nearly invisible in darkness. Their boots were specially crafted to make minimal noise on any surface. Their weapons were the latest military technology: silent rifles with laser-guided targeting systems, pistols that fired armor-piercing rounds, and chemical weapons designed to incapacitate or kill without leaving obvious traces. Their leader, known only by the codename Ghost, was a tall, lean figure whose real identity was buried under layers of false documents and corporate secrecy. His voice, when he spoke into his encrypted headset, carried the flat, emotionless tone of a man who had long ago lost any connection to normal human feeling. "Remember the parameters of this operation," he said quietly, his words transmitted to his team through communication systems that cost more than most people in Burkina Faso would earn in their lifetimes. "No witnesses, no evidence that can be traced back to any particular government or corporation. Kill the president, neutralize the dog, stage the scene to look like a terrorist attack, then extraction within 30 minutes.
Ghost had studied the intelligence files on both Traore and Diablo. He knew about the president's military background, his popularity among the people, and his policies that threatened certain corporate interests. He also knew about the dog, the remarkable intelligence, the specialized training, the almost supernatural loyalty that had made him legendary among those who had faced him in combat. But Ghost was a professional who believed that enough firepower and tactical superiority could overcome any enemy, no matter how determined or well-trained. He had killed politicians, journalists, activists, and military leaders across 3 continents. One African president and his dog, no matter how formidable, were just another job to be completed efficiently and quietly. The Shadow Unit began their assault by climbing the palace stairs, with movements so smooth and coordinated that they seemed like smoke given human form. Each man knew his role, his position, his backup plans. They had studied the palace's blueprint for weeks, memorizing every corridor, every door, every possible hiding place or escape route. Their night vision equipment turned the darkness into green-tinted clarity, giving them what they believed was an insurmountable advantage over their targets. Their communication system allowed them to coordinate their movements with split-second precision. Their weapons could kill from a distance or up close, silently or with overwhelming force. But there was one element of the palace that their intelligence had failed to fully account for. Diablo was not just a guard dog, but a creature whose senses had been honed by both natural evolution and human training to levels that bordered on the supernatural. The dog was positioned on a massive ceiling beam, his body pressed flat against the ancient wood, his breathing so controlled that he seemed to have become one with the architecture itself. His eyes, those remarkable crimson orbs, tracked the movement of the Shadow Unit members below with the focused intensity of a predator who had found his prey. He waited with the patience that his training had taught him, understanding that timing in combat was often more important than strength or speed. The first mercenary passed directly beneath his position, night vision goggles sweeping left and right but never looking up, a tactical error that would prove fatal. Diablo dropped from his perch without any sound, his armored body descending like a meteor of justice.
He struck the soldier's shoulders with the full force of his weight and momentum, driving the man to the ground with bone-crushing impact. The mercenary's night vision equipment shattered, his rifle skittered across the marble floor, and his carefully coordinated advance dissolved into chaos. The sound of impact echoed through the corridor, not loud, but distinctive enough to alert the other Shadow Unit members that their operation was no longer proceeding according to plan. But before they could react effectively, Diablo had already vanished back into the darkness, leaving behind only a wounded enemy and the growing realization that they were facing something unprecedented. "Where did it go?" one of the mercenaries whispered into his headset, his professional composure beginning to crack. These were men accustomed to having technological and tactical advantages, to fighting enemies who could be predicted and countered using standard military doctrine. "Maintain formation," Ghost's voice crackled back through their headsets. "It's just an animal. Stay focused on the primary objective." But even as he spoke these words, Ghost was beginning to realize that their intelligence had been inadequate. The dog's attack had been too precise, too tactically sound to be the work of an ordinary guard animal. This was something else, a warrior who happened to walk on 4 legs instead of 2. Diablo struck again, this time from the side, using his speed and agility to dart in and out of the formation like a shark attacking a school of fish. His claws, reinforced and sharpened through training, found gaps in body armor with surgical precision. His teeth, evolved for crushing bone, made quick work of equipment and exposed flesh. But this time the Shadow Unit was ready for him. As soon as he emerged from the shadows, multiple rifle barrels swung toward him, laser sights painting red dots on his armored hide. Bullets sparked off his protective gear, forcing him to retreat before he could complete his attack. The corridor erupted in controlled chaos as the mercenaries attempted to track and eliminate a target that refused to behave according to their tactical manuals. Diablo moved with an intelligence that frustrated their efforts to predict his movements, using every architectural feature of the palace, columns, doorways, decorative alcoves, as cover and concealment. President Traore heard the escalating gunfire and knew that Diablo was facing odds that even his remarkable abilities might not be able to overcome. The time for hiding and waiting had passed. It was time for the president of Burkina Faso to fight for his nation's independence with his own hands. Emerging from cover with his pistol raised, Traore took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean and precise, striking one of the mercenaries in the center of mass and dropping him immediately. The president's military training had not been forgotten during his years in politics. Every shot would count, every movement would be calculated for maximum effect. "Diablo!" he called out, his voice cutting through the chaos of gunfire and ricocheting bullets. Diablo appeared at his side almost instantly, his armor scarred but intact, his eyes blazing with the fire of battle. Together they represented something that the Shadow Unit's employers had not anticipated: the unbreakable spirit of a people who refuse to surrender their dignity and freedom to foreign interests, no matter how well-funded or professionally executed the assault against them might be. The battle in the palace corridors had become more than a fight between soldiers. It had become a clash between 2 different visions of Africa's future. On one side stood those who believed that African nations should be sources of raw materials and cheap labor for global corporations. On the other stood those who dared to dream that African people could control their own resources, educate their own children, and build their own futures without permission from distant capitals.
And in that marble corridor, surrounded by the artwork and architecture that represented centuries of African civilization, that battle was being fought with bullets and blood, courage and determination, by a man and his dog who had chosen to stand against the darkness. The Shadow Unit, realizing that conventional tactics were failing against their unconventional enemy, decided to escalate their assault. Ghost's voice crackled through their headsets with cold precision. "Deploy chemical agents. End this now." Two mercenaries reached for cylindrical containers attached to their tactical vests, chemical weapons that had been banned by international treaties, but were still manufactured in secret facilities and sold to those willing to pay premium prices for absolute results. The gas inside these containers was a neurological agent designed to attack the nervous system, causing paralysis and death within minutes. The corridor suddenly filled with yellow gas that spread with terrifying speed, seeming to have a life of its own as it rolled along the floor and rose toward the ceiling like a malevolent spirit. The chemical cloud moved faster than any human could run, seeking out every corner and crevice where a victim might try to hide. President Traore, caught in the open when the gas was deployed, felt the poisonous vapors begin to burn his throat and lungs almost immediately. His eyes watered uncontrollably, his vision blurred, and violent coughing fits seized his body as his respiratory system tried desperately to reject the toxic assault. This was death in its most cowardly form, invisible, inescapable, designed to kill without giving the victim any chance to fight back. But even as his body was being attacked by the chemical weapon, Traore's mind remained focused on his loyal companion. Through the haze of pain and approaching unconsciousness, he could see Diablo standing in the middle of the corridor, his powerful legs beginning to shake as the gas penetrated even his enhanced physiology. "No!" Traore shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. Ignoring the bullets that whistled past his head, he leapt from his position behind the marble column and ran toward his four-legged partner. The Shadow Unit mercenaries, confident that the gas would finish their work, held their fire for a moment, watching with professional interest as their targets slowly succumbed to the chemical attack. Traore grabbed Diablo's collar, feeling the dog's weight as his strength began to fail. Together they stumbled toward the nearest room, bullets beginning to fly again as the mercenaries realized that their quarry was still mobile. The president slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind them and collapsed on the floor, his lungs burning as if filled with acid. Diablo lay beside him, his breathing growing increasingly labored. The remarkable intelligence in his crimson eyes was beginning to dim as the neurological agent did its deadly work. His armor, so effective against bullets and claws, was useless against an enemy that attacked from within. But the room they had entered was not chosen randomly. President Traore, in his years of military service, had learned that preparation for every possible scenario was the key to survival. When he had moved into the palace, he had insisted on certain modifications that his security staff had thought excessive but had implemented nonetheless. On the wall was a small metal panel, painted to blend with the room's decor, but accessible to those who knew where to look. Traore's shaking hands fumbled with the lock, his vision swimming as the chemical agent continued its assault on his nervous system. Finally, the panel swung open, revealing a collection of medical supplies that represented some of the most advanced emergency treatments available. Among these supplies was a small injector labeled Protocol Alpha, an experimental antidote that had been developed specifically for Diablo's unique physiology. During the dog's training, military veterinarians had become concerned about the possibility of chemical attacks and had worked with scientists to develop a treatment that could counteract the most common neurological agents. The injector contained a cocktail of drugs that would boost Diablo's natural immune system, neutralize the chemical toxins, and provide his body with the energy needed to fight off the attack. But it was experimental, untested in actual combat conditions, and there was no guarantee it would work, or that it wouldn't kill Diablo faster than the gas.
Traore's hands trembled as he positioned the injector against Diablo's flank, just behind the damaged armor plating. The dog's breathing was so shallow now that it was barely perceptible, his magnificent crimson eyes starting to lose their focus. Time was running out. For both of them. "Stay with me, son," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. He pressed the injector's trigger. There was a sharp hissing sound as the cocktail of experimental drugs entered Diablo's bloodstream, followed by an agonizing moment of silence. The president held his breath, watching his loyal companion's face for any sign of improvement or, God forbid, further deterioration. For several seconds, nothing happened. Diablo's body remained motionless, his breathing still barely detectable. Traore began to fear that he had administered a death sentence rather than a cure. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dog's chest began to rise and fall with more strength. Diablo's eyes snapped open, and they blazed with an intensity that was even more fierce than before. The experimental treatment hadn't just neutralized the chemical attack, it had somehow enhanced his natural abilities. His breathing returned to normal, strength flowed back into his muscles, and when he stood up, there was something different about him, something almost supernatural. The Protocol Alpha had activated dormant genetic traits that had been bred into his lineage over generations, traits that connected him to the legendary war dogs of ancient African kingdoms, animals that had been revered not just for their physical abilities, but for their spiritual connection to the warriors they served. Outside the door, the Shadow Unit was growing impatient. Ghost's voice cut through their headsets with increasing urgency. "The gas should have done its work by now. Move in and confirm the kills. We're running out of time before local military units arrive." The mercenaries approached the door behind which Traore and Diablo had taken refuge, confident that they would find only corpses. They had used these chemical weapons before, in other countries, against other leaders who had dared to challenge the global order. The results were always the same: quick, efficient, and impossible to trace to their real employers. But as they prepared to break down the door, a tremendous explosion shook the entire wing of the palace. The wooden door, reinforced with steel plates, burst outward in a shower of smoke, splinters, and flame. The explosion wasn't caused by their weapons. It came from within the room, as if the very walls had decided to fight back against the invaders. From the smoke and fire emerged two figures that would haunt the nightmares of any Shadow Unit members who survived this night. President Traore, covered in sweat and dust but moving with the deadly grace of a combat veteran, held his rifle with both hands, his finger steady on the trigger. Beside him, Diablo moved like a creature from another world. The dog's armor was now scorched and battle-scarred, but his crimson eyes glowed with an otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the smoke and shadows. The Protocol Alpha had not only saved his life, it had transformed him into something beyond what nature and training alone could create. He moved with fluid grace, his senses enhanced to levels that bordered on the mystical. Ghost raised his advanced rifle, its laser sight painting a red dot on Traore's chest, but before he could squeeze the trigger, Diablo was already in motion. The dog covered the distance between them in what seemed like a single bound, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to dodge bullets that should have been impossible to avoid. The Shadow Unit mercenaries, trained to handle any combat situation, found themselves facing something outside their experience and training. Diablo wasn't just faster and stronger than before. He seemed to anticipate their movements, to know where they would aim before they aimed, to attack from angles that defied tactical logic. He struck the first mercenary with such force that the man's body armor cracked, sending him flying backward into the wall with bone-crushing impact. Another soldier fired a burst from his automatic weapon, but Diablo had already moved, the bullet striking only empty air and marble chips. President Traore joined the battle with cold precision, each shot from his rifle carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. His military training had never left him, and years of studying the tactics used against African leaders had taught him exactly how such operations were conducted. He knew that these mercenaries were professionals, but they were also predictable. They followed patterns that could be exploited by someone who understood their methods. "For Burkina Faso," he shouted, his voice echoing through the palace corridors like a battle cry that reached back through centuries of African resistance against foreign domination. The shadow unit found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire between a president who fought like a soldier and a dog who moved like a supernatural guardian. Their technological advantages, night vision, advanced weapons, superior numbers, meant nothing against enemies who combined tactical skill with an unbreakable determination to defend their homeland. One by one, the mercenaries fell. Some tried to retreat, only to find that Diablo had somehow circled behind them, cutting off their escape routes. Others attempted to call for extraction, but their communication equipment had been damaged in the explosions that marked this battle. Ghost, the unit leader who had orchestrated this assault with such confidence, found himself face to face with President Traore in a corridor now littered with the bodies of his men. His expensive equipment was damaged, his tactical plan had collapsed, and for the first time in his professional career, he was facing the possibility of failure. "You cannot stop what's coming," he said, his voice still carrying the cold professionalism that had made him successful in so many other operations. Traore looked at him with the steady gaze of a man who had always known this moment would come. "Let them come," he said quietly. "Burkina Faso has survived slave traders, colonial armies, and corporate raiders for centuries. We will survive you too." The final confrontation was brief but decisive. Ghost reached for a concealed weapon, but Diablo was already in motion. The dog's enhanced senses had detected the subtle shift in the mercenary's stance, the barely perceptible movement towards his backup pistol. When the smoke cleared, Ghost lay motionless on the marble floor, his expensive equipment scattered around him like broken toys. The shadow unit's mission had failed completely, not because of superior firepower or better technology, but because they had underestimated the power of genuine loyalty and the determination of people fighting for their own freedom. The palace fell into an eerie quiet that was more unsettling than the chaos of battle. The silence was broken only by the distant wail of sirens as emergency services finally responded to the explosions and gunfire that had shattered the peace of Ouagadougou. President Traore stood in the middle of the corridor, surrounded by the debris of what had been one of the most sophisticated assassination attempts in recent African history. The marble floors, once polished to mirror brightness by generations of palace workers, were now cracked and stained with blood. Bullet holes scarred the walls like angry wounds, and the ancient wooden artwork that had told the story of Burkina Faso's proud history lay in splinters. The very architecture seemed to weep for the violence that had been inflicted within these sacred spaces. Diablo sat beside his master, his enhanced senses still alert for any remaining threats. The Protocol Alpha continued to course through his system, keeping his abilities heightened to superhuman levels. His armor was now a patchwork of dents and scorch marks, each mark a testament to the battles he had fought this night. But his crimson eyes remained as bright as ever, reflecting an inner fire that no amount of violence could extinguish. Traore placed his hand gently on Diablo's head, feeling the warmth of his loyal companion's body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You did more than enough tonight, son," he said softly, "but I fear this is far from over." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor.
not the running boots of soldiers responding to an emergency, but the measured, confident walk of someone who belonged in this place. The steps were calm, deliberate, carrying the authority of someone who had walked these halls for years without challenge. At the far end of the corridor, a door opened with the soft creak of well-oiled hinges. From the shadows stepped General Damiba, the head of presidential security and one of Traore's most trusted advisors. He was a tall, imposing figure whose military uniform was, as always, impeccably pressed and adorned with medals earned in decades of service to Burkina Faso. Damiba had been Traore's mentor when the younger man first entered military service, teaching him tactics and strategy, sharing wisdom gained through years of defending the nation against various threats. He had been present at Traore's inauguration as president, standing proudly beside the podium as the young leader took his oath of office. "Mr. President," Damiba said, his voice carrying its usual tone of respectful formality, "thank God you're alive. When I heard the explosions and gunfire, I feared the worst." But there was something in his voice that didn't ring true, a quality that Traore's enhanced sensitivity, sharpened by the night's violence, immediately detected. The tone was too controlled, too perfectly modulated, like an actor delivering lines he had rehearsed. Traore did not lower his rifle, keeping it ready in his hands as he studied his old friend and mentor. Diablo, whose enhanced senses were now operating at levels that bordered on the supernatural, let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emerge from the depths of his soul. "Where were you during the attack, General?" Traore asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I was inspecting the western perimeter when the alarms began sounding," Damiba replied smoothly. "I came as quickly as I could once I realized the palace was under assault. The western gate was sealed 3 hours ago. The security cameras in that sector were disabled. You didn't radio for a status report, didn't attempt to contact me directly, didn't coordinate with other security units." Damiba took a step closer, his hand resting casually on the grip of his sidearm. "I was following emergency protocols, Mr. President. When the palace is under attack, the security chief's priority is to assess the threat and coordinate the response." "No," Traore said, his voice growing harder. "You came to see whether I was dead or alive. You came to confirm that the mission was complete." For a moment the mask slipped from Damiba's face, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the facade of loyalty and concern. It was the look of a man who had sold his soul and was now discovering that the price had been higher than he had anticipated. "You were supposed to be a puppet, Ibrahim," Damiba said, abandoning all pretense of loyalty or friendship. "Young, popular, easy to manipulate. We thought we could guide your policies, moderate your more radical ideas, keep you focused on domestic issues, while the real business of the country was handled by those with more experience." "We?" Traore asked, though he already knew the answer. "People who understand how the world really works," Damiba replied. "People who know that small countries like Burkina Faso survive by finding their place in the global system, not by fighting against it." The general's words carried the bitter taste of betrayal that went far deeper than simple corruption. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about a fundamental difference in vision for what Burkina Faso could become. Damiba represented those who believed that African nations were destined to be junior partners in a global system controlled by others, while Traore embodied the dream of genuine independence and self-determination. "But you started acting like a real leader," Damiba continued,
his voice taking on a tone of genuine regret mixed with frustration. You gave people hope, made them believe they could control their own resources, their own future. You frightened people in very important places. Good, Traore said simply. You have no idea what you're up against, Damiba said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. This isn't just about Burkina Faso. Your policies are being watched in other countries, other capitals. Young people across Africa are looking to you as an example. That makes you dangerous to a lot of very powerful interests.
I served this country for 30 years, Damiba said, his voice now carrying genuine pain. I fought against terrorists, against bandits, against every threat that emerged from outside our borders. But I also learned that some fights cannot be won, that sometimes survival requires compromise. Compromise? Traore's voice was filled with the quiet fury of betrayal. You call selling out your own people a compromise? Damiba's hand moved toward his weapon, but Diablo was already in motion. The dog's enhanced reflexes, still boosted by the Protocol Alpha, allowed him to cover the distance between them before the general could draw his pistol. With a single powerful leap, Diablo knocked the older man to the ground, his jaws closing around Damiba's wrist with enough pressure to disarm him without causing permanent damage. The general's weapon clattered across the marble floor, and Traore walked slowly toward his former mentor, his rifle still ready. There was sorrow in his eyes, the pain of discovering that someone he had trusted and admired had been working against everything they had supposedly fought for together. "Tell me who," Traore said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Tell me who bought you, who planned this, who thought they could murder an African president in his own palace and install a puppet government." Damiba looked up at him from the floor, blood trickling from his lip where Diablo's tackle had thrown him against the wall. For a moment, his facade of cynical calculation cracked, revealing the man he had once been, a soldier who had genuinely served his country before the corruption of global politics had eaten away at his soul. "They don't have names you would recognize," he said, his voice now hoarse with pain and shame. "They don't wear uniforms or hold public office. They sit in boardrooms in London, New York, Paris. They wear expensive suits and speak in the language of economic development and international cooperation." "And they have already chosen my replacement," Traore said, completing the picture. "A more reasonable leader, someone who understands the necessity of foreign investment, the importance of maintaining stable relationships with international partners. Someone who will sell our gold and uranium at prices they set, who will allow our young people to work in their factories for wages they determine, who will keep our farmers growing crops for their markets while our own people go hungry." Damiba's silence was answer enough. "I won't back down," Traore said, his voice carrying the absolute conviction that had made him beloved by his people and feared by his enemies. "I know," Damiba said, and there was something approaching respect in his voice. "That's why tonight was just the beginning. They have resources you can't imagine. Economic pressure, media manipulation, political interference. They can make your people suffer until they beg for relief, even if that relief comes at the price of your removal from office." The general's words painted a grim picture of the challenges that lay ahead. The failed assassination attempt would be followed by other forms of pressure, economic sanctions that would be described as responses to human rights concerns, media campaigns that would portray Traore as a dictator threatening regional stability, and political interference designed to isolate Burkina Faso from its neighbors.
But before he could elaborate further, Damiba's hand moved to his mouth with a swift motion that neither Traore nor Diablo could prevent. He bit down on something he had concealed between his teeth, a small capsule that released its contents with a barely audible crack. "No!" Traore shouted, reaching toward his former friend, but it was too late. The explosion was contained but devastating. Damiba had activated a small incendiary device designed to destroy evidence and eliminate the possibility of interrogation. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of the general but ash and the bitter smell of chemicals. Traore stared at the spot where his mentor had been, feeling the weight of betrayal settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Diablo pressed against his leg, offering what comfort a loyal companion could provide in the face of such devastating treachery. The president realized that tonight's events had only revealed the tip of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, one that threatened not just his presidency, but the very idea that African nations could control their own destinies. When the first golden rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the red earth of Ouagadougou in warm light, President Ibrahim Traore appeared on the palace balcony. The sight that greeted him would have brought tears to the eyes of any leader who truly loved his people. Below, the streets of Burkina Faso's capital had transformed into a sea of humanity. What had begun as scattered groups of concerned citizens during the night had grown into a massive demonstration of solidarity that stretched as far as the eye could see. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Old men leaning on walking sticks but standing proud, young women carrying babies on their backs, children who should have been in school but had come instead to stand with their president. The crowd was a living representation of Burkina Faso itself. Farmers from the country still wearing the dust of their fields, merchants from the markets with their colorful traditional clothing, teachers and students, mechanics and drivers, all united by a common purpose. They carried the red, green, and gold flags of their nation, but more than that, they carried something intangible but powerful: hope, determination, and an unshakable belief that their country belonged to them, not to foreign corporations or puppet governments.